A retired marine biologist walks onto a crowded beach where 40 anglers have been casting for hours with nothing to show. He tosses 3 small objects into the surf from his pocket, waits exactly 4 minutes, then casts a plain hook with a piece of shrimp. Within 20 seconds, his rod doubles over. He lands a 4-pound pompano, rebaits, casts again. Another fish, then another. In 35 minutes, he catches 18 fish while everyone around him stands frozen, watching in disbelief as his section of beach erupts with feeding activity that looks like a shark is pushing bait fish to shore. When someone finally asks what he threw in the water, he smiles and says it's something he learned studying reef ecosystems that creates the exact chemical signature of a feeding frenzy. Something that costs 47 cents to make and works in any saltwater or freshwater environment where fish compete for food. The other anglers assume he's lying or exaggerating because nothing legal should work that dramatically. But this isn't exaggeration, and it's not illegal. It's applied marine biology that commercial bait companies discovered in the 1970s, tested extensively, then quietly shelved, because it worked too well to be profitable. If anglers could create feeding zones on demand using pocket change, who would buy their endless stream of scented plastics, flavored jigs, and miracle attractants that barely move the needle? The technique the biologist used isn't his invention. It's based on research published in marine science journals that the fishing industry hoped recreational anglers would never read or understand. Research showing that certain organic compounds, when released in water, trigger what's called competitive feeding response, where fish abandon normal caution and attack anything edible because their brain interprets the chemical signals as evidence that other fish are actively feeding and food is scarce. It's a survival mechanism hardwired so deep that even heavily pressured fish in tournament waters will respond despite having been caught and released multiple times. Welcome to Angler's Vault, the only channel that reads actual scientific literature instead of regurgitating tackle company marketing disguised as fishing advice. If you're tired of techniques that sound good on YouTube but fail on the water, subscribe now, because we're about to bridge the gap between what marine biologists know and what tackle shops want you buying. This competitive feeding trigger is just one example of peer-reviewed science that exists in academic journals but never makes it into fishing magazines, because it threatens the product-based revenue model that keeps the industry profitable. I've spent 2 years translating marine biology research into practical fishing applications that actually work, and everything I've learned is compiled in the Complete Angler's Blueprint. The link is in the description, but first you need to understand what that biologist threw in the water and why it created chaos. The objects he tossed were frozen cubes made from blended fish guts mixed with vegetable oil and gelatin. Each cube is roughly 1 inch square and contains about 2 tablespoons of material that costs essentially nothing if you clean your own fish or ask at a fish market for scraps they're throwing away anyway. Here's how you make them. Take any fish carcass, the leftover parts after filleting including guts, head, bones, skin, everything you'd normally discard. Blend it completely in an old blender you don't use for food until it becomes a chunky liquid paste. Add equal parts vegetable oil and mix again until it emulsifies into a thick slurry. Pour this mixture into ice cube trays, filling each compartment about 3/4 full. Top off each cube with water mixed with unflavored gelatin powder, which acts as a binder that holds everything together underwater longer than it would naturally. Freeze these cubes solid, then store them in a sealed bag in your freezer where they'll remain effective indefinitely. When you arrive at your fishing spot, toss 3 to 5 cubes into the water about 30 feet from where you plan to fish. Wait 4 to 6 minutes for them to thaw and begin releasing their contents into the water column. Then fish normally using whatever bait and technique you prefer, because the cubes have created the chemical environment that turns passive fish into aggressive competitors. The science behind why this works is documented in dozens of studies on fish behavior and chemical ecology that tackle companies would prefer you never encountered. When fish guts decompose in water, they release amino acids, nucleotides, and fatty acids in specific ratios that predatory fish evolved to recognize as evidence of recent predation or active feeding. It's the chemical equivalent of blood in the water for sharks, except it works on every species from bass to bluegill to redfish. When multiple fish detect these compounds simultaneously, their brain doesn't interpret it as potential food. It interprets it as competition for food that's already being consumed by other fish nearby. This triggers what researchers call resource competition behavior, where fish will strike at anything remotely edible because the presence of feeding competitors means they need to act fast or miss out entirely. The vegetable oil serves 2 critical functions that make this technique dramatically more effective than simply throwing fish guts in the water. First, it slows the release rate of amino acids and other compounds, creating a sustained scent trail that lasts 20 to 30 minutes instead of dispersing in 5 minutes. Second, it creates a visible surface slick that fish associate with bait fish activity, because bait fish oils naturally float when schools are feeding or being attacked. The visual component amplifies the chemical component, hitting multiple sensory systems simultaneously and creating a feeding response that's stronger than either stimulus would produce alone. The gelatin binder is the innovation that makes this practical for recreational anglers, instead of just being theoretical science. Without gelatin, the frozen cubes would dissolve too quickly and create a brief, intense scent burst that dissipates before fish have time to locate and congregate in the zone. With gelatin, the cubes slowly melt and release their contents over the optimal 20 to 30 minute window that allows fish to detect the trail, follow it to the source, and remain in the area actively searching for food while you're fishing. You're essentially creating a temporary reef ecosystem where the chemical signature of abundant food draws fish from the surrounding area and concentrates them in your fishing zone. Now here's where this gets interesting from an industry conspiracy standpoint. A major bait company developed a commercial version of this exact technique in 1978 after funding university research on fish chemical ecology. Their internal testing showed it increased catch rates by 300 to 400% compared to fishing, without it across multiple species and conditions. Marketing teams projected it would generate massive sales initially, but then crater the market for other attractant products because anglers who used it successfully would stop buying everything else. The company's board made a calculated decision to shelve the technology and focus instead on incremental improvements to existing product lines that keep customers buying new variations every season without ever actually solving their problems. That research sits in their archives while they continue selling you scented plastics that provide maybe a 10 to 15% improvement over unscented versions, enough to justify the purchase, but not enough to make you actually satisfied with your results. Think about how this changes your entire approach to fishing once you understand it. You're not just throwing bait in the water and hoping fish happen to be nearby and interested. You're actively manipulating the chemical environment to create the conditions that make fish gather and compete in your chosen area. You're using the same biological mechanisms that reef fish use to locate food sources and that predators use to find feeding opportunities. The tackle industry wants you focused on lure color, rod action, and line diameter because those are variables they can monetize through constant product updates and seasonal trends. They don't want you thinking about water chemistry and biological triggers because once you understand those fundamentals, you realize that most of the gear differences they sell you are irrelevant compared to simply putting fish in a feeding mood. This frozen cube technique costs 47 cents per fishing trip if you clean your own fish, maybe $2 if you're buying scraps from a market. Compare that to the $20 to $30 anglers typically spend per trip on various attractants, scent products, and specialty baits that promise to solve the problem of getting fish to bite. Over a fishing season, you're looking at $15 versus $800 for the same outcome, except the cheap method actually works better because it's based on biology instead of marketing. The reason I'm sharing this isn't to save you money, although that's a nice side effect. The reason is that once you understand you've been deliberately kept ignorant about techniques that work because they're not profitable to sell, you start questioning everything else the industry has told you about what you need to be successful. You realize that the vast majority of fishing advice you receive through magazines, YouTube, and tackle shop recommendations is designed to drive product sales rather than actually improve your catch rate. This frozen cube method is just the beginning of what's possible when you stop listening to people trying to sell you things and start listening to scientists who study how fish actually behave. Subscribe to Angler's Vault because we're building a community of anglers who care more about understanding fish biology than collecting tackle. And that shift in perspective is what separates those who occasionally get lucky from those who consistently catch fish regardless of conditions.